Marvel Avenged, from financial ruin to the biggest film franchise in history. 15 years ago, Marvel had just escaped bankruptcy. This week, it could overtake Harry Potter as the biggest film franchise in history. Avengers, Age of Ultron, the 11th movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, hits UK cinemas on Thursday, the week before the US. If box office predictions are correct, it will quickly become the franchise's third billion-dollar movie, pushing Marvel ahead of the $7.7 billion made by the 8 Potter films, and far beyond the likes of James Bond, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings. It's a huge turnaround for a company which, for decades, played second fiddle to its arch-rival DC Comics. While DC scored major box office hits with Superman and Batman, Marvel's rich and diverse roster of characters were relegated to Saturday morning serials. Its sole cinema venture in the 1980s was the risible Howard the Duck, a colossal flop that inexplicably featured an interspecies romance as its subplot. Meanwhile, more obviously cinematic characters like Spider-Man and Captain America languished in development hell. Everyone was considering making Marvel movies, but the budgets were just too high, says Sean Howe, author of Marvel Comics, The Untold Story. Certainly before Terminator 2 there wasn't the technology to do anything in a convincing way. By the time the technology was available to bring Marvel's stable of superheroes to life, the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. The comic book market crashed in 1993, thanks to a glut of underwhelming titles, and a crisis of confidence amongst collectors. Sales dropped by 70% and Marvel was left heavily in debt. Shares that had been worth $35.75 in 1993 dropped to $2.38 in just 3 years. The firm was only saved by a merger with toy company Toy Biz, whose boss, Avi Arad, was appointed president of Marvel's film division after a drawn-out boardroom battle. Arad looked at the botched attempts to license Marvel movies in the early 1990s, including a cheap, unreleased production of Fantastic Four, and made a decision: in the future, Marvel would commission its own scripts, hire its own directors and negotiate with stars. Then it would sell the whole package to a major studio, which would shoot and distribute the film. When you get into business with a big studio, they are developing 100 or 500 projects, you get totally lost, Arad told the New York Times in 1996. That isn't working for us. We're just not going to do it anymore. Period. The strategy worked. Fox bought the X-Men, Sony took on Spider-Man, and New Line made the Blade trilogy. Only Marvel wasn't sharing in the profits. According to an article on Slate, the company made a mere $25,000 from the first Blade film. And, of the $3 billion that Spider-Man 1 and 2 raked in, Marvel saw only $62 million. Worse still, as Hollywood jumped on the superhero bandwagon, it rushed out films based on Elektra, The Punisher and Daredevil, which proved to be creative and commercial disappointments. Things got a little out of our hands, admitted Marvel president Kevin Feige on the company's own website. That's when we started to think about making the movies internally. Going it alone. So Avi Arad, along with Chief Operating Officer David Meisel, went to Wall Street to get funding for an independent studio, making films based on second-tier characters the company hadn't already licensed elsewhere, starting with Iron Man. The funny thing about the plan is that Marvel used character rights as collateral, says Howe. So if Iron Man was a disaster, they would give up a whole bunch of characters to the backers. That included the Avengers, but the way the deal was worded was that it didn't say who the Avengers were. And if you know comic book history, you know that the Avengers can be any of 50 different characters. So that was sneaky. They could have said, okay, you have the rights to the Avengers, so here's Jack of Hearts and the Two-Gun Kid. Of course, Iron Man wasn't a disaster, but it was perceived as a massive gamble. The lesser-known superhero, played by troubled Robert Downey Jr. in his first-ever blockbuster lead role, directed by indie filmmaker Jon Favreau, it was far from a guaranteed hit. But it delighted fans and critics alike, thanks in large part to Downey Jr.'s irreverent, wisecracking portrayal of billionaire inventor Tony Stark, the refreshing change from Christian Bale's poke-faced Batman. The breezy tone set the template for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where character and comedy are given equal emphasis to visual spectacle. And, with the nerd-pleasing, post-credits appearance of Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, Iron Man teased the possibility of the first Avengers film. "You think you're the only superhero in the world?" Fury asks, as he starts the process of building the superhuman supergroup. "Mr. Stark, you've become part of a bigger universe." The narrative snowball of Marvel, the way that everything accumulates, means it gets bigger and more popular but also more unwieldy, he says. That happened in the comic books. With all the crossovers, everything became completely uninviting to the new fan. Eventually, Marvel had to hit the reset button and start over again, because you couldn't hold all of it in your head. Ironically, that could be the biggest danger to the success of the movies. There are so many storylines that you have to navigate in telling this bigger story, that eventually fatigue sets in, especially with people who are not already 100% on board. There's a lot of significant others being dragged to these movies who are going to rebel.